Hello, everyone. My name is Lane Little, and I'm the director of the Pauly Friedman Art Gallery at Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania, which is in Northeast Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us for the Compulsory Measures Virtual Artist Roundtable. This is a series of 9 conversations where we talk to the artists in the show about their creative processes. The series has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities CARES grant called Humanities in the Time of COVID-19, Fostering Community Dialogue. In this episode, we're talking with Jorge Benitez. With a new startup company, Jorge Benitez designs and creates luxuriant, one-of-a-kind weavings. He is a native of Cuba who spent his formative years in Belgium and is fluent in French and Spanish. His work reflects an earlier career in advertising, an interest in the American culture wars, and his study of the links between words, images, and demagogic politics. After the events of September 11, 2001, he became increasingly interested in his own Spanish ancestry and the Iberian links to the Muslim world, while simultaneously mistrusting the notion of identity. He currently participates in regional and international exhibitions and writes on subjects ranging from the Cuban Revolution to postmodernism. His work is represented in corporate collections and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Recently retired, Professor Benitez taught drawing, art theory, and history of visual communications in the Communication Arts Department at Virginia Commonwealth University. He holds an MFA and BFA in painting from Virginia Commonwealth University. George, welcome, and thank you so much for participating in this virtual roundtable series. For those of you watching, please submit your questions and comments using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And George, I'll let you tell us more about your practice, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you for the introduction. It's always a little humbling to hear all that. So I hope I can live up to it. Everything you said pretty much represents the work. Following on what we talked about yesterday with all the other wonderful artists in the group, I come out of similar traditions. We're all pretty much the same age and have a similar educational background. I guess in my case, the only difference was living abroad and having been born overseas. But aside from that, you know, a product of the 60s and 70s and all the good things and upheavals of that era. And also the postmodern aspect, which took us away from that very formal approach of the 40s and 50s. So in my case, the reintroduction of representation, but informed by abstraction, which I love very much, and also by pop art, which of course was big when I was young. These drawings were from 2001, and they were actually done before the September 11 attacks. These were a response to the horrors of the Timothy McVeigh attacks or the attack in Oklahoma City in '95. And I was really concerned about the rise of gun violence in the United States. And of course, that was a bombing in Oklahoma City. But the fact that there were already militias at work doing incredibly violent things and planning essentially by their own language, the overthrow of the government. So having grown up Catholic, the idea of penance was very important to me. And I did these portraits of guns as penance. They don't show any violence. They're also problematic because the objects themselves are very beautiful. So guns have a sculptural quality and a sense of engineering that makes them very appealing. And by not showing any violence, I just wanted to demonstrate the seductive aspect of them. And then the penance was in working in graphite to the point that I almost got carpal tunnel. And then this was, of course, 2001, 2002, I started doing these little tiny paintings of nuclear explosions based on photographs, of course, of actual explosions. And again, that element of seduction. And a lot of that had to do with my upbringing, also attending beautiful churches in Europe where you would see these martyrdoms that were depicted in luscious colors and beautifully rendered. And you go, my gosh, what is going on here? These people are suffering horribly in the pictures, but yet the paintings themselves are incredibly beautiful. And then I also, having grown up during the Cold War and the idea that we could be blown up at any moment, I was very interested in the fact that we pretended none of that could happen. So that's when I came up with the idea of intimate paintings for suburban homes, so that we couldn't run away from what we had done. These drawings are completely from my imagination. There's no reference material, no external references at all. And they're based on perspective, and that's work from graduate school. I was older when I started graduate school in 2004. And I got very interested in perspective as a metaphor for Western civilization. And that's when I started to look at neoclassic architecture and its totalitarian implications in the 20th century and now in the 21st. And also got very interested in looking at Islamic culture, but from a Western point of view. So in this case, this is the Victory in Iraq Triumphal Arch, Crawford, Texas. And of course, we did not win that war. It just remained open-ended. And the idea of a triumphal arch that has these pseudo ancient Middle Eastern elements, and it's essentially a neoclassical building in the middle of nowhere. So there's what is going on, what does it mean, what possible purpose could it have? It's all open-ended questions. And then an imaginary rifle in perspective, again, drawn without any reference material, done in a completely geometric way. And then that led to these very strange pictures of non-existent objects with patterns. So again, the idea of beauty applied to both nonsense and things that are very disturbing, potentially troublesome. What I discovered in all of these pictures was that audiences responded with a combination of pleasure and incredible confusion. They were not disturbed by the subject matter. They were bothered by the fact that it was nicely done. And so that was a very, very interesting discovery, because I mean, I didn't plan that. These were mockeries, again, based on perspective. The guy in the picture does not exist. I just made him up. And a play on AutoCAD or computer-assisted design. And then a mockery of Clement Greenberg done in perspective. And then this was a follow-up on that. The translation of it is dangerous baptisms, because the baptismal font looks like it's filled with petroleum, with oil. And I've lost track of this painting. I don't know where it is. That's why I don't have the dimensions. And the same thing with this one. Again, this factory-like thing we don't know where it is. It's completely out of place. And again, from perspective drawings. So working without any references, strictly from my imagination. This is in the same vein, very small little oil painting. And once again, virtual things. I have no idea what this is. It's a bowl with what I call a potato shape, but it could be a rock. I have no idea what's going on here. So this led to a series of drawings that are currently being shown in another exhibition that's traveling around, organized with Reni Gower. And these are small drawings, pure line drawings in graphite from architectural perspective drawings that I do without any references, except that this was inspired a little bit by some trips I had taken to Qatar with Virginia Commonwealth University, and some of the architecture in hotels looked like this. And again, taking these Middle Eastern motifs, which I was exposed to as a child because they're all over Latin America. The Spanish brought them over when they were building their empire. They had been given to them by the Muslim occupation of Spain, and then they just brought them over with the conquest and colonization. And I started saying, well, what if it were combined with Western perspective, what would happen? So again, same idea with this one. These are all graphite drawings. And then this is one of the sculptures. And this is probably the first one that I did. I started it in 2015, completed the building, but didn't actually decide to paint it white until 2015. So 10 years went by before I completed it. And it was the genesis of all the other things that I've been doing since. And then the title, the idea of the Temple of Syncretic Possibilities, is a commentary on a time of incredible confusion. We supposedly can do anything we want these days, and yet we find ourselves more restricted than ever. And this is the process. So I start out by cutting illustration board and just heavy cardboard sometimes, and gluing it, making sure that it's braced from the inside. It's layer after layer, panel after panel. And they're incredibly strong, but very light because they're essentially mostly illustration board.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to read you one of my students' responses. Most of my students are not visual artists at all. They have very little experience with it, but they're troopers for trying, I think. And this is from a student whose major is in the literary arts. So he had a very sort of introspective look at your work, and he was doing a shelter, which for you viewers is the work that's over my right shoulder here, both the color and the black and white. He wrote about that. He said, I interpreted a shelter as how someone who is suffering from depression can attempt to put on a mask during the daytime to appear normal to friends and family. If I could ask the artist anything, I would ask, what message did you have in mind when you were creating these two pieces, and what did you wish to express in the contrast from the black and white painting to the one in color?
Well, I never have a specific message in any of my paintings, and I welcome the student's question because his or her interpretation is as legitimate as anyone else's. And I'm not trying to be pluralistic or democratic or evasive with that answer. I think the whole idea of paintings like this is to allow the viewer to bring whatever it is they bring to the table and to have that be relevant. In my case, again, not a specific message on my part, but my experience with shelters is twofold, that shelters protect and imprison. So that which keeps out also keeps in. And I'm not going to go into details, but we're living in a time where things are being kept out, but it's a double-edged sword. It also keeps in. So I've never viewed a shelter or any kind of protective space as being exactly that. It can serve two purposes that are contradictory, and it's up to the individual to decide what it's going to be at any given moment.
Yeah, he was looking particularly at the architecture of the structure, and he wrote a little bit about the sort of ambiguity of the window that's in the top there. Is it a window? Can you see out of it, or is it just an indentation to make you think that there's a window? And he was really fascinated with this fantasy and illusion that was being created by these images.
No, that's very astute. And in fact, when I do these, I'm not thinking about any of those issues. To be honest, the paintings catch me off guard when they're done.
Yeah.
And that's when I have a very strange reaction to my own work. And I go, good heavens, what was going on? So, and a lot of my fellow artists work the same way, whether they work representationally or non-representationally. I think when the work is really clicking, it should be a surprise to the artist.
And we had another class come through, and there was a creative writing class, not an art class, and so they were trying to imagine themselves as the painting, as the artwork. And when I was taking them through the gallery that has your work in it, I asked them specifically to think about the image of black and white versus, or monochromatic versus something in. How does information get transmitted when you don't have color? Is there a interpretation that somehow it's more objective or more documentary as opposed to something that's more out of the imagination? Are those issues that you think about in your work as far as how what that end result interpretation might be?
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I think that's a very important point. Do I think about it specifically? No, I think about it in general terms. My biggest concern is with, this sounds a little cynical, but it does come out of an aspect of modernism. Anybody who's read Duchamp would recognize it. I don't have much faith in communication. And I learned that as a child because I was trilingual out of necessity, not by choice. And what I realized that no one really understood anyone else, even when they're speaking the same language, which I think is one of the problems we have in the United States today and around the world. So the black and white versus color, the closest analogy I can think of, it was Spielberg's father. When Spielberg did Schindler's List, Spielberg's father, who was a World War II veteran, said, you know, I was there. It was in color. Whereas Spielberg thought the Holocaust should be in black and white. His dad, who had actually fought in the Second World War, couldn't understand his son's rationale because he experienced the full horror of the war in color. And that's always struck me. I mean, I thought that was a very interesting discussion between father and son. But also when we look at Victorian photographs, and they're so, because photography is so convincing, we assume that the Victorian world was in color. And yet it was during that era that Impressionism was invented. I mean, that the Victorian era was black and white. And it was at that time that the Impressionists began an explosion in color. So again, which one communicates the era?
I'm totally going to use that Spielberg quote. I'm going to find that and use it in my classes. Because later in the semester, we're going to talk about another Guernica and the
Yes.
documentary aspects of that. So I will definitely bring that up. And let's see if there's any messages from the viewers. I know Reni, the curator, is online. Did you want to chat, Reni?
So great discussion. I love being the listening person today. Jorge, is there any way to zoom in on those figures on your table behind you?
I don't know how to do that. I can grab them. Those were some of the sculptures I wanted to show. Let me just grab a few. So. Because
before your PowerPoint cut off, you were talking about the sculptures and how you fabricate them, but then they became like the still life material for your paintings. And so everything was kind of like in reverse order.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see any of these. These are actually from this summer. And they're the first non-architectural sculptures that I've done in the round. Because I don't think of myself as a sculptor. I mean, my education is in painting and printmaking and drawing. I had a wonderful mentor in graduate school. And one day I said to him, you know, I'm not a sculptor. And he had a very blunt and wonderful way of speaking. And he said, shut up, you're a sculptor. So that cured me of that. But these are little tiny pieces that I did this summer. And I will use them as models for upcoming paintings. Here's another one.
A lot of your sculptures actually have sort of gargoyle-esque.
They do. And I mean, my work is always very dark, but not on purpose. And that was something else that I realized, that I never set out to express anything. It just happens automatically. I was very distrustful as a young artist when I was starting out as an undergraduate of people who talked about self-expression, because to me, it's a given. So to make an issue of it gets in the way. And I've often heard novelists, for example, say that they just start writing. You know, they may have an idea for a plot line or characters, but they start writing. The feelings are after the fact. If you're doing the work sincerely and you're in the moment, and that was something that I think everybody alluded to yesterday in our conversation. You know, we go into our studios and we talked about the ritual of making the work. To me, that's enough. And then what happens comes up as a surprise.
It's also very interesting that your conversation is following Christy Dietrich's conversation this morning. You both have this sort of darker humor at work in a lot of your artwork.
Yeah.
But do you want to talk about?
Well, it was interesting yesterday when everyone was talking about the pandemic and how that's affected our studio practice. And then I felt a little self-conscious because I thought, oh my gosh, I mentioned that I'm a recluse. I shouldn't have let that go on the internet. But the interesting thing to me about the pandemic, and Reni knows me really, really well, is that I'm actually a very happy person who loves the darkness because it takes away all expectations. So from the time I was a very little boy, because of the nature of my upbringing, the things that I encountered with the revolution and all that as a child, my expectations were so low that just waking up in the morning was a happy event. I thought, oh gosh, I'm alive. Isn't that wonderful? I can do something today. And if I'm lucky, I may be able to do something else tomorrow. So by the time I was a teenager and living in the United States, I couldn't understand adolescent angst. So I rebelled against rebellion. I rebelled against my peer group rather than my parents. And that has served me really, really well as an artist because I get to enjoy making art, and then these horrible things come out that are a lot of fun to look at.
Were you artistic as a child?
That is a great question. I wanted to be a scientist. My dad was a chemist. I had no talent for mathematics. And what I realized was that I enjoyed making things. And that's what led me into art.
So you ended up as a sculptor, but you started with painting.
Yeah,
And you
and
said you came to it later in life.
I was 48 when I started making the first sculptures, and now I'm 64 years old, so that gives you some idea of the time frame. But yeah, I never thought I would get into that. It was really model building for my drawings. I was having difficulty figuring out where shadows were going to go. And the fascinating thing about that process is that all my best teachers and mentors in graduate school were non-representational painters.
Ah.
And Reni remembers that because she was there. And they were so supportive of what I was doing. And there were a lot of conversations on the issue because some casual observers who would go by the studios would say, oh my gosh, what are you doing reinventing the Renaissance? And it was my professors who understood that I wasn't. I was actually very much of this time. And I really, it came out of modernism. I mean, my way of thinking comes very much out of modernism and modern formalism, but with that representational element.
Now, we talked about, now the class that I teach is called Symbols and Subjects and Symbols, and it's about how to represent big ideas with smaller visual kinds of iconographies and symbols. And one of the things we talked about this week was the metaphor of perspective. So we're working with Japanese printmaking and the right to left orientation, and all of a sudden you see left to right in Hokusai. What is he doing? Is he signaling? And that was perfect timing for my class this week.
Well, the Japanese use of perspective is very, very interesting on levels that go beyond art history, especially in this day and age, revisiting ukiyo-e and revisiting Hokusai and Hiroshige and all of those great Japanese masters, because there's a theory in post-colonial studies that says that perspective was a Western imposition. In the case of Japan, it certainly was not. The Japanese were receiving books from Europe, and they fell in love with the idea. And what they did was they reinvented it. In fact, they showed the West how to use perspective in ways that we had not thought of. They moved the vanishing point in directions that anticipated the camera. They invented cinematography 100 years before the motion picture. And they did that because they brought that marvelous Japanese sense of asymmetry and the idea that in Japanese art, there is no negative space. There are no empty spaces. What we think of as an empty space to them is as filled as what we would cram with information. So being very familiar with Japanese art, because it was my first love as a teenager, and I'm not talking about anime, that we didn't even know that existed. I'm talking about the first art book I ever bought. I was about 13 years old, and it was on Hiroshige. So it was the real deal. Getting back to Hiroshige, I started to see that the Japanese reinvention of perspective actually brought a freshness to it that contradicted everything that had been said about it. And I'm not so sure that they were signaling something different or that they were using it for a different symbolic purpose. I think it was just a way of seeing that was totally fresh and that reinvigorated, as a result, Western art.
Well, I mean, I'm loving this story that Japanese art was your first love. If you'd like to, I'd like you to continue with that a little bit and see if that plays into any of the works that we have here in the show. And then I'll close and that'll be it, if that's okay.
Unfortunately, it doesn't play into the pieces that are currently in the show. It does in the ones I had in the PowerPoint from this summer. But for me, Japanese art spoke to something that's very dear to me, which is the global aspect of civilization and culture. The thing that upsets me the most about the times in which we're living, and that's why I am very leery of the idea of identity, is that I am very dedicated to internationalism. And very dedicated to the idea of a human culture built on everything that emanates from everywhere in the world. I think it's because as a child, I didn't have a set home, and I was switching languages constantly and switching cultures constantly. And I fell in love with that. And the notion of being trapped in a single culture with a single label is anathema to me. So what Japanese art did for me was that it opened the door to rediscovering the West. And it was the same thing with Islamic art. I make no distinction between the Middle East and the West. Reni knows this from, we've gone together to the Middle East and have taught there. So I'm a firm believer in a single human civilization. And that's problematic nowadays. I could get in a lot of trouble just for saying that, just for being hopeful about our species. That's not a popular idea in this day and age. But I think that's one of the things that the darkness in my work reflects. It questions false optimism, and it questions false expectations. And I try to go into something a little bit deeper, which going back to Japan is something that occurs both in Buddhism, but also in the Catholicism in which I was raised. That if you let go of expectations, you'd be surprised all the good things that can happen.
It's wonderful. I like the, particularly when we're thinking about Islamic art visual traditions, Japanese art visual traditions, that implied extension of space, even though we see something that is very flat and doesn't have the Renaissance perspective that we're used to, that these spaces go out forever. You can see so much from this perceived flattening of space, an entire floor, an entire back of the room.
And it's all good. I mean, that's the interesting thing. And Renaissance perspective has to be seen within its own time. It filled a need for that era, which was the humanization of God. And I've lectured on this extensively in my classes, especially in my drawing, but also my history of communications classes, that the difference between the Renaissance and the Middle Ages is that Christ becomes a baby in the Renaissance. You can reach out and touch him. And to put him in a perspectival space with a Virgin Mary who also looks like flesh and blood, as opposed to the medieval version, that shows a shift in the consciousness of the period, which is they're coming to grips with their own humanity. So they create divine imagery that reflects their changes. It doesn't reflect anything about the divine. What it speaks is about the people who are making the art and viewing the art, including the clergy. And I think something similar happens in Japan with perspective. The Japanese discover in perspective a way of reinventing their own understanding of space. It's not a Western imposition. It's a borrowing that gives them a new way of seeing the world. And then they give it back to us. And to me, that's the wonderful part.
That's what I want my students to take away from this exhibition of seeing. I like the fact that this is unique for us because we have so many works by the same artist, and they can see these tiny choices that individual artists are making from work to work, as well as seeing this all as a group, as different interpretations, different voices of how we deal with reality, how we deal with the world. I think it's been a really good experience for them. And I thank you and Reni for your generosity in loaning us the work and in taking the time to talk to us. For those watching, I hope that you can catch the remaining 2 episodes of our series. On Monday, September 28, we'll be talking with Al Denyer at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then on Wednesday, September 30, we'll be talking with Joan Elliott at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. A catalog of this entire exhibition is available for purchase by download from blurb.com, and we'll put that information on our website. Please follow us on YouTube and Facebook. We'll post the entire series of all 9 interviews that we had with our artists, and keep up with us on Facebook and Instagram for more updates. Thank you again, George and Reni, for participating. It was so nice to talk with you, and we'll see you all again next time.